The morning they mocked her, Marie arrived before the sun had begun its crawl over the skyline. The city still slept, but the building, Lexicon Tower, was already humming. A few early risers tapped away in glass-walled offices, security guards sipped burnt coffee, and somewhere above, the boardroom lights flickered to life. She moved with practiced ease, pushing the wheeled janitorial cart down marble-tiled hallways she knew better than anyone. Her presence went unnoticed by design. No one really saw a janitor, not the employees, not the executives, not even the cameras. People only saw what they expected to see, and Marie had spent years hiding behind expectations. Her uniform was crisp, but old, navy blue with a faded name patch that read Marie. Her silver-streaked braids were tucked neatly under her cap. Her boots were worn but polished. Everything about her screamed invisible. She had been watching Lexicon Tech for years. Not just the company, but the people inside it. The rising stars, who sold futures they didn't fully understand. The venture capitalists who thought charisma could outpace competence. The self-assured men who built empires on borrowed ideas. Marie watched them all from the edges, unseen, unbothered. Today was different. Today, she didn't come to clean. Lexicon Tech was hosting its annual Investor Summit, a day when board members and venture capitalists gathered on the 42nd floor to hear about product launches, funding rounds, and market dominance. The kind of day filled with overconfident grins, sharp suits, and champagne disguised as strategy. Marie had spent weeks preparing. Not mops or bleach, she hadn't touched those in months. What she prepared was a file. A black leather binder, tucked under a stack of microfiber cloths on her cart. Inside was a deed, several contracts, stock transfer agreements, and one quiet letter signed by Lexicon's original founder. Nobody remembered the founder. He had died years ago. But Marie had been there. She had been in the room when the idea for Lexicon Tech was scribbled on a napkin. Back then, she wasn't a janitor. She had been the money, the legal backbone, the silent partner no one photographed. When the company was still small, he had promised her something that no board meeting could erase. Ownership. Not shares, not options. Property. The building. Itself. The one everyone in Lexicon Tech now assumed belonged to the company. But the company didn't own the building. Marie did. Every tile, every window, every keycard entryway. And today, the lease was up. They hadn't read it, of course. The executives had inherited their offices, their roles, their authority. None of them ever bothered to look at the actual lease agreement. It had been written years ago, buried in a file somewhere, and quietly renewed with auto payments and administrative neglect. But the clause Marie had insisted on remained. Full ownership of the building would revert to her unless explicitly extended by the board. They had 30 days to respond when notified. That deadline passed last Friday. Marie had sent the certified letter herself. Now, as she entered the 42nd floor, the temperature dropped. She could feel it. Anticipation. Not the nervous kind, the arrogant kind. The kind that made men laugh, too loud and ignore too much. They didn't know. Not yet. The boardroom was all glass and chrome, perched like a jewel at the top of the tower. Marie had cleaned it hundreds of times. She knew where the speakers were hidden, where the emergency access panel behind the media screen was, and where the floor safes lay flush with the marble. The room was meant to impress. It usually did. Inside, the executives began to gather, talking over one another, adjusting slides, prepping for what they thought would be another easy day of praise and projections. Marie waited, not outside. She walked in. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't storm. She didn't raise her voice. She simply wheeled in her cart, lifted the top cloth, and placed the binder at the head of the table. One by one, they looked at her, then at each other. Confused, then amused, then dismissive. Marie didn't blink. She stood as one of them opened the binder. She watched his face tighten, then pale, then shift into a kind of stunned blankness that couldn't hide what he was reading. Ownership, termination clause, eviction authority. Effective today. Marie didn't have to speak. The documents did all the talking. The laughter stopped, replaced by silence so thick it pressed against the windows. Some looked to the CFO, some to the legal counsel. Others just stared at the woman they had never once really seen. She had given them the chance to renew the lease. They hadn't. She had waited. Now she was enforcing what was hers. The building would be vacated by end of day. No exceptions. No negotiations. Marie turned and walked out as quietly as she had entered. She didn't need applause. She didn't need revenge. She had the deed and the next move. By noon, the panic had spread. What started as quiet confusion in the boardroom trickled into chaos across every floor of Lexicon Tower. Emails went unanswered. Calls were ignored. Assistants whispered in corners, glancing at the elevators like they might stop working at any moment. Marie's name began to float through hallways and Slack channels like a ghost suddenly remembered. Some tried to call their lawyers. Others tried to reason their way through the binder Marie had left, as if reading it enough times would change the words printed in bold, legal certainty. The CEO, a man who prided himself on being the youngest to ever take the company, public, disappeared behind his office door and didn't come out. None of them knew who she was. That's what scared them most. They searched her name in internal records and found nothing but a third-party janitorial subcontractor listing. No HR file, no onboarding documentation, no badge records beyond a generic maintenance ID. Yet she had walked straight into the boardroom like she owned the place. Because she did. In a locked server room 2 floors below, Marie stood alone. She typed with the care of someone who had never rushed a thing in her life. She didn't need to hack. She didn't need access codes. She had them all, tucked into a password manager she built herself more than a decade ago. Back when Lexicon Tech still held meetings in rented co-working spaces and no one cared who cleaned up after. Most people didn't know this, but Marie had a law degree, Ivy League, top of her class. She never advertised it, never framed the diploma, never corrected people who assumed she was just the help. That was the beauty of invisibility. It gave her access. People said things when they thought no one of. Importance was listening. Over the years, she collected secrets like spare change. She knew when the CFO had covered up a missed audit. She knew which lead engineer had stolen code from a competitor. She knew how the company's valuation was, being propped up with inflated growth metrics and paid press placements. She had watched them cut corners, sell lies, and celebrate themselves for surviving another funding round. The building was the only thing real. Lexicon Tech didn't own its soul. It had been leasing one from a woman they didn't even know was in the room. Marie had never needed to remind them, until now. Years ago, when she made her initial investment in the startup, she told the founder she didn't want stock options or a title. She wanted property, something they couldn't dilute or restructure, something no market crash could erase. He had laughed, called her old-fashioned, but he signed the deal. Now he was dead, and the company he left behind had forgotten how it was built. Marie walked to the rooftop. The wind was sharp but clean, and the city stretched endlessly around her. From this high, the people below looked like ants, urgent, busy, small. She watched delivery trucks weave between cabs, watched a drone hover near a window before blinking. Away. The skyline hadn't changed much since she first came here, but the people had. They all wanted to be kings. None of them knew how to build kingdoms. Inside, word spread faster than wildfire. The lease was real. The enforcement was legal. There were no backups. The legal team scrambled to find loopholes, but Marie had covered every angle. The original lease, written in her hand and signed in ink, included clauses few modern attorneys would ever think to check: handwritten riders, notarized amendments, emergency eviction language. It was a master class in quiet leverage. By 3 p.m., security began escorting people out. Not at Marie's request, by law. Without a valid lease, they were trespassing. Some resisted. Most complied, stunned, carrying boxes filled with branded mugs and overpriced tech gear. The tower emptied slowly, like a sinking ship abandoning passengers deck by deck. Marie watched from her old janitor's closet, now repurposed, as a temporary office. No one had ever opened it, never noticed the shelf filled with financial reports or the filing cabinet that held more power than the boardroom ever had. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't sleek, but it was hers. She sat in a folding chair, sipping lukewarm tea from a dented thermos. It tasted better than anything served at their catered meetings. That afternoon, the press got wind. Someone leaked the story. An anonymous tip. A janitor had just evicted a tech giant from their own building. Social media exploded. News vans parked outside. Think pieces began forming within hours. Commentators speculated. Some called it a hoax. Others called it justice. A few tried to spin it as performance art, but the documents were real. Public record confirmed it. The building was registered under a holding company, and that holding company was owned, entirely and without contest, by one Marie Lynn Holloway. By sunset, Lexicon Tech was shut out completely. The building stood silent. 37 floors of empty offices, untouched whiteboards, and blinking routers. The startup that once bragged about disrupting the future had been outmaneuvered by a woman they never once saw coming. And Marie, she sat in the heart of the tower they had abandoned, exactly where she had always belonged. She didn't need revenge. She had the deed, and this was only the beginning. Long before the marble floors, before the glass towers and news headlines, Marie Lynn Holloway was just a girl in Baltimore who read everything she could get her hands on. Books were her escape. Not fairy tales or fantasies, but law books, biographies, and financial ledgers discarded by her neighbor, a retired attorney who didn't have children and didn't mind a curious child knocking at his door. She would sit for hours on his porch, steps, flipping through dense texts that most adults avoided. She didn't just read them, she understood them. By 16, she could recite sections of the U.S. tax code. By 18, she had a full scholarship to Columbia. Law school followed, then clerkships, and finally a fast-tracked career in corporate law. She never wore flashy suits. She never played the politics. But she was always prepared, always quiet, always underestimated. That became her edge. Her specialty was contract law, the fine print, the traps, the overlooked clauses that ruined or saved fortunes. In meetings, she would watch men interrupt each other to make points she had already underlined. They never asked her what she thought. Until the day they needed her, and by then it was too late. She worked for large firms, helped billionaires protect their assets, restructure debt, hide liabilities. She saw how the game worked, not just legally, but morally. And she grew tired. After decades of protecting people who didn't value her, Marie walked away. No announcement. No retirement party. She cashed out every stock, every bonus, every undervalued real estate holding. Then she vanished from the world that thought it couldn't run without her. She didn't stop working. She simply changed how. She created a private holding company with no flash and no online footprint. She bought small buildings, apartment complexes, abandoned warehouses, anything people thought was beneath them. She learned how to repair pipes, how to spot structural cracks, how to balance a portfolio without a single meeting. She diversified, and she never put anything in her own name until it was secure. Eventually, she bought the building that would become Lexicon Tower. At the time, it was nothing but scaffolding and promise. The startup that would one day be Lexicon Tech was 3 people with laptops and unpaid invoices. The founder had passion but no capital. He pitched Marie at a small business expo, not knowing who she was. She listened, asked questions he wasn't, prepared to answer, and saw something in him, something she could shape. She offered the only thing they didn't expect: stability. Not just cash, but structure. She had one condition: no board seat, no title, just the deed to the building and a hard lease, non-negotiable with sunset clauses that would trigger full control if ignored. They agreed. They laughed, but they agreed. Years passed. The company grew. Staff multiplied. Floors filled. The founder died in a car accident, and leadership changed hands. New CEOs came and went, none of them knowing who Marie was. As the company expanded, the assumptions grew. 2. Everyone believed the building was part of Lexicon Tech's assets. No one checked, no one asked. Marie stayed in the background. She took the janitor contract under an alias. She cleaned, watched, listened. She knew the servers better than the IT team, knew which interns cried in stairwells, knew who doctored investor reports before pitch meetings. To them, she was just Marie, the night janitor. They left pizza boxes on desks, scuffed floors, and spilled lattes without apology. She cleaned, smiled, and made mental notes. And, all the while, she waited. She waited for them to break their own lease, to become so arrogant, so complacent, they wouldn't bother reading what had kept them afloat. She sent them renewal warnings disguised as routine maintenance alerts. She let the deadline pass without urgency. And when the time came, she didn't need to shout. She let the building speak for her. Now, the world was beginning to learn her name. Not the Marie they thought they knew, but the woman who had spent 40 years mastering the art of silence, who had built an empire by watching others chase noise. The media coverage grew wilder each hour. Articles called her the Shadow Queen of Silicon Valley. Think tanks requested interviews. Financial analysts scrambled to trace her holdings, but they wouldn't find much. Marie had learned early on. The power wasn't in being seen. It was in being untraceable. From her new office, a former data closet she had repurposed into a minimalist command center, Marie monitored the final shutdown of Lexicon Tech's infrastructure. They had no idea how to recover. They had built their company on speed and spectacle, never substance. And now they were gone. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't even angry. She was deliberate. The building was hers. The leases would be renegotiated, on her terms. The space wouldn't sit empty. She already had plans: tech incubators for underrepresented founders, shared offices for women-led startups, mentorship programs hidden inside architecture firms and code schools. She would fill the tower again, not with noise, but with potential. The irony was sweet. For years, they had built a culture around disruption, but it was Marie who delivered the cleanest disruption of all, without a word, without a press release, and without even raising her voice. She wasn't finished. She had 27 other buildings, and every one of them had a clause. A week after the eviction, the building no longer echoed. It breathed. Where once there had been rushed footsteps and shouted deadlines, there was now a purposeful quiet, measured, steady. Marie had begun the process of redesigning the tower from the inside out. Not in structure, but in function. She didn't tear down what Lexicon Tech had built. She reclaimed it. Gone were the lavish offices with unused treadmills and ping-pong tables. Gone were the espresso bars where executives held ego contests disguised as meetings. In their place were communal workspaces, affordable rental suites, mentorship hubs, and small-batch incubators for people no one usually bet on. Single mothers with app ideas. First-generation college kids pitching hardware. Coders without degrees, but with genius in their fingertips. Creatives who couldn't afford downtown real estate but had innovation bursting from their minds. Marie gave them a floor. She didn't advertise. She didn't brand it. No LinkedIn post, no grand opening. Those who needed it found it. And those who entered walked into something that felt less like a business and more like a shift. She named the new initiative quietly, Clause 27. A nod, too. The overlooked clause buried deep in Lexicon Tech's original lease. The clause that gave her ownership, control, and choice. A single paragraph no one had ever read carefully enough, and yet it had changed everything. Clause 27 was more than a program. It was her final act of precision. Each floor of the building now had a different purpose. One for startups under $10,000 in funding. One for formerly incarcerated entrepreneurs. One for high school students with prototypes but no mentors. She funded them herself, through the same holding company that had once owned only silence. Not everyone was happy. Former Lexicon Tech executives took to the press, spinning narratives. They painted Marie as a vindictive saboteur, a symbol of anti-tech hostility. But their noise was short-lived. Investigations into their finances revealed deeper problems: debt hidden behind shell companies, inflated valuations, misused funds. The company had always been a balloon filled with warm air. Marie had simply let it float away. She never clapped back. She never appeared on a podcast or responded to op-eds. She was busy. On the 33rd floor, she built something for herself. Space not open to the public, not leased to tenants. Just hers, not an office, a studio, a sanctuary. Walls lined with maps, property plans, legal books, and handwritten notes that traced back decades. This was where she planned the next moves. There were other buildings, in Chicago, in Atlanta, in Oakland. All of them acquired slowly, quietly, legally. All of them protected by contracts that carried her fingerprints but never her name. She didn't need the world to know what she owned. She needed control. Not the kind men brag about in boardrooms, but the kind that shapes futures. She had studied empires, not the ones with thrones and armies, but the ones built in skyscrapers and policy rooms. And she had always noticed the same flaw. They left people out. Brilliant people, capable people, people who just didn't look like what power was supposed to look like, so she built a new map, one where those people weren't just included, they were centered. Every quarter, she brought in 10 new entrepreneurs. They didn't apply. She found them at bus stops, on community bulletin boards, through late-night emails from nonprofit, directors who still believed in potential. She sat across from them, sometimes in silence, sometimes in conversation. She didn't ask for resumes. She asked for truth. Most didn't recognize her. To them, she was just another old woman with curious eyes and a quiet voice. Some found out later. Some never did. That was fine with her. They didn't need to know her history. They were the history she was writing. The city began to whisper. They called the building the Tower of Second Chances. Tenants whispered stories of mentorships that came with no strings attached, of investors who were told to wait their turn, of a landlord who sometimes mopped her own floors just to stay grounded. In truth, Marie didn't believe in second chances. She believed in the first chances people were never given. And now, she was giving them. Across town, Lexicon Tech's executives attempted to rebuild. They rented floors in a much smaller building with no view and far too much rent. Their staff had dwindled. Their funding dried up. They filed lawsuits. They lost them all. Marie never countersued. She had no interest in petty war. She had already won by walking away intact. Her silence was her signature. One afternoon, long, after the building had settled into its new rhythm, Marie returned to the janitor's closet on the 42nd floor. It had been left untouched since eviction day. Inside was her old cart, her cap, her clipboard, A small radio she used to play classical jazz while cleaning late nights. She sat in the same folding chair, sipping tea from the same dented thermos. She smiled, not because she had fooled them, but because they had given her exactly what she needed: space, time, and invisibility. In their ignorance, they had handed her the most powerful position of all, one without suspicion. She left the cart behind. It belonged to the story, not to her future. As she stepped back into the hallway, now filled with new faces and untested ideas, she felt something shift, not in the floor beneath her, but in the air itself. It was no longer the tower they thought they owned. It was hers. And it was awake.